I was standing at my living room window with a cup of coffee when I saw the excavator rolling down my driveway toward the massive snow pile I'd carefully built along my property line. My first thought was that someone had made a serious mistake, but then I spotted the HOA logo plastered on the side of the truck towing it. My name is Henry Foster, and I live in Meadowbrook Estates, a supposedly upscale neighborhood in Eden Prairie, Minnesota. I'd bought my house here 3 years ago, thinking it would be a quiet place to settle down after my divorce. The house itself was perfect, a 4-bedroom colonial with a huge yard that backed up to a small forest preserve. What I hadn't counted on was the HOA being run by a woman named Patricia Henderson, who had turned neighborhood management into her personal fiefdom. The snow pile in question was something I'd been working on all winter. Minnesota winters are brutal, and we'd gotten hammered with storm after storm since December. It was now mid-February, and I'd been strategically piling all my snow along the eastern edge of my property. Not just anywhere, mind you, but specifically on my side of the property line, creating a windbreak that protected my driveway from the worst of the drifting snow. The pile was easily 8 feet tall and stretched about 40 feet long. I threw on my boots and coat and headed outside, not bothering to zip up as anger propelled me forward. The excavator operator, a guy in his 30s wearing a weathered Carhartt jacket, was already positioning the machine. "Hey!" I shouted over the diesel engine noise. "What do you think you're doing?" The operator looked down at me from the cab. "Got a work order from the HOA to remove this snow pile. Says it's a violation." "A violation of what exactly?" I climbed up on the track to get closer to him. "That pile is entirely on my property." He shrugged and pulled out a tablet, showing me a work order signed by Patricia Henderson herself. "Says here it's creating a drainage hazard and violating the aesthetic standards of the community." Aesthetic standards? It's snow. It'll be gone in 2 months anyway. The cold air bit at my face as I gestured wildly at the pile. "And I never authorized this work." "Don't need your authorization, apparently. HOA has the right to enter properties to remedy violations. Says so right here." He pointed at some fine print on the screen. I pulled out my phone and immediately called Patricia. She answered on the 3rd ring, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Hello, Henry. I assume you're calling about the snow removal." "You're damn right I am. You can't just come onto my property and move my snow." "Actually, I can." Article 7, Section 3 of the HOA bylaws clearly states that the board has the right to remedy any violation at the owner's expense if the violation isn't corrected within 14 days of written notice. What written notice? I never got any notice. I personally delivered it to your mailbox 2 weeks ago. The violation was for creating an unsightly snow accumulation that impacts the neighborhood's appearance. I wanted to throw my phone. "Patricia, that snow pile is serving a purpose. It's protecting my driveway from drifts. And even if you did send a notice, which I never saw, you can't charge me for work I didn't approve. The bylaws say otherwise. The excavator service will cost $2,000, which will be added to your HOA account. If you don't pay within 30 days, we'll place a lien on your property." Her voice had gone from sweet to ice cold. "Have a nice day, Henry." She hung up before I could respond. I stood there in the snow, watching as the excavator operator looked at me with something between sympathy and impatience. "Look, man," he said, "I'm just doing the job I was hired for. I got a contract with the HOA and they're paying me to move this snow. If you've got a problem with it, that's between you and them." "Who hired you? What company are you with?" "Hanson Excavation. Lady from the HOA called us yesterday, said it was urgent." Something clicked in my brain. "How much is she paying you for this job?" $2,000, same as what's on your work order there. I did some quick mental math. An excavator rental around here went for about $400 a day, maybe $500 for a nice one with an operator. This job would take maybe 2 hours, 3 tops. Patricia was gouging me. I'll tell you what, I said, an idea forming. How about I pay you directly right now and you can leave the snow where it is? The operator scratched his jaw. Can't do that. I've got a contract with the HOA. They paid half up front already. If I don't complete the job, I don't get the second half, plus I'd be in breach of contract. I watched as he fired up the excavator again, the bucket swooping down toward my carefully constructed snow pile. Each scoop felt like a personal insult. He was dumping the snow in the empty lot at the end of the street, I noticed, which was also HOA property. The whole thing would take about 2 hours, just as I'd estimated. I went back inside and immediately started digging through my files. Patricia had mentioned sending a written notice, but I'd never seen anything. I checked every piece of mail from the past month. Nothing. I even checked my spam folder and email. Still nothing. My neighbor, George Martinez, knocked on my door about an hour later. George was retired, spent most of his time working in his garage on woodworking projects, and had become a good friend since I'd moved in. Saw the commotion earlier, he said, stomping snow off his boots. What's going on? I explained the situation while making us both coffee. George listened, his expression growing darker. Patricia's been on a tear lately, he said. Last month she fined the Johnsons because their Christmas lights weren't white. Month before that, she threatened to fine old Mrs. Chen because her mailbox was the wrong shade of black. The wrong shade of black. Apparently there's an approved list of paint colors. Who knew? George shook his head. But this thing with the excavator, that's different. That's serious money she's throwing around. And charging to homeowners, I added. I bet I'm not the first person she's pulled this on. George's eyes lit up. You know what? You're right. Remember when the Thompsons had that tree removal last fall? Patricia said it was dead and posed a hazard, had it cut down and charged them $3,000. But that tree looked fine to me. We spent the next hour calling around to other neighbors. What we discovered made my blood boil. Over the past year, Patricia had authorized nearly $20,000 in emergency remediation work across the neighborhood, all billed directly to homeowners, and all without anyone's prior approval or consent. She was using the bylaws as a weapon, interpreting them in the most extreme way possible. The excavator finished its work around noon. I watched from my window as it loaded back onto the trailer and drove away. My snow pile was gone, and with the next storm, my driveway would be buried in drifts again. That evening, I sat down with a beer and read through the HOA bylaws cover to cover. It was 70 pages of dense legal text, but I was determined to find something useful. What I found was interesting. Yes, Article 7, Section 3 did give the HOA the right to remedy violations, but only after proper notice and an opportunity for the homeowner to appeal. There was supposed to be a hearing before the board before any work was authorized. I'd gotten no notice, and there had definitely been no hearing. The next morning, I drove down to the office of Mike Reynolds, a real estate attorney I'd worked with when buying the house. Mike's office was in a strip mall in Bloomington, sandwiched between a tax preparation service and a nail salon. "Henry," Mike said, shaking my hand. "What brings you by?" I laid out the whole situation. Mike listened, taking notes on his legal pad, occasionally asking clarifying questions. "Okay," he said when I finished. "First things first, did you ever receive written notice of the violation?" "No. Patricia claims she put something in my mailbox, but I never saw it." "And was there a hearing before the board?" "Not that I know of." Mike leaned back in his chair. Then they didn't follow their own procedures. The bylaws are pretty clear. You're entitled to notice and an opportunity to be heard. Without that, the work order isn't valid. So I don't have to pay. Not only do you not have to pay, but you might have grounds to sue the HOA for trespass, and for the value of the snow removal work you actually wanted to keep. Mike tapped his pen on the pad. That snow pile was serving a legitimate purpose on your property. They had no right to remove it without proper procedure. What should I do? Write a formal letter to the HOA board disputing the charge. Reference the specific procedural violations. I'll draft it for you. Then we wait and see how they respond. If they push back, we might need to file suit. I left Mike's office feeling vindicated but still angry. The whole situation was absurd. I was potentially going to have to sue my own HOA over a pile of snow. The letter went out 3 days later, sent via certified mail to ensure there was proof of delivery. In it, we laid out the procedural violations, demanded that the charge be removed from my account, and requested compensation for the damage done to my snow management system. We asked for $500, which was what it would cost to hire someone to rebuild the snow pile. Patricia's response came within a week. She rejected everything, claiming that the notice had been properly delivered and that no hearing was required for health and safety violations, which she was now claiming the snow pile constituted. She also informed me that if I didn't pay the $2,000 within 20 days, the HOA would place a lien on my property and potentially foreclose. She's bluffing, Mike said when I showed him the letter. She can't foreclose over $2,000, and even if she could, it would take months or years. But this does tell us something important. What's that? She's not going to back down, which means we need to go on offense. Mike filed a lawsuit in Hennepin County District Court the following week. We sued both the HOA and Patricia personally for trespass, violation of the bylaws, and breach of fiduciary duty. We asked for actual damages of $500, plus attorney's fees and costs. The lawsuit got people's attention. Suddenly, neighbors who'd been quietly grumbling about Patricia's overreach started coming forward with their own stories. The Thompsons with their tree, the Johnsons with their Christmas lights, which had resulted in a $500 fine. Mrs. Chen, who'd been charged $200 for someone to come repaint her mailbox with approved paint. George helped me organize a meeting at his house. 16 homeowners showed up, all with complaints about Patricia and the HOA board, which consisted of Patricia as president, her friend Deborah Mills as secretary, and a guy named Tom Carter who seemed to just go along with whatever Patricia wanted. "We need to recall the board," said Janet Thompson, a lawyer herself who lived 2 streets over. "The bylaws allow for a special election if we can get signatures from 30% of homeowners." "How many is that?" someone asked. "There are 80 homes in the development," George said. "So we need 24 signatures." We had 16 people in the room. Getting to 24 seemed doable. Over the next week, we canvassed the neighborhood. It was easier than I expected. Almost everyone had a Patricia story. The woman who'd been fined because her lawn wasn't green enough in July during a drought. The couple who'd been cited for parking their own car on their own street overnight. The family who'd been threatened with fines because their kid's basketball hoop was visible from the street. We collected 38 signatures, well over the required threshold. Janet drafted the recall petition and filed it with the HOA according to the procedures in the bylaws. A special election would be held in 30 days. Patricia was furious. She sent out an email to the entire neighborhood claiming that the recall was being orchestrated by malcontents who don't respect the rules. and that the HOA was operating exactly as it should. She listed all the wonderful things the board had accomplished, like maintaining the common areas and organizing the annual neighborhood garage sale. But the email only made things worse for her. Several people who hadn't signed the petition before now came forward asking to add their names. Meanwhile, my lawsuit was proceeding. Discovery had started, which meant we could request documents from the HOA. Mike asked for all financial records for the past 2 years, all contracts with vendors, and all correspondence related to violation enforcement. What came back was eye-opening. The HOA's books were a mess. Patricia had been signing contracts left and right, often with companies that charged well above market rate. The tree removal that cost the Thompsons $3,000. Market rate for that work was about $1,200. The mailbox repainting for Mrs. Chen should have cost $50, not $200. But the most interesting discovery was about Hanson Excavation, the company that had moved my snow. According to the contracts, Hanson was owned by a guy named Robert Hanson. According to public records, Robert Hanson was Patricia's brother-in-law. "That's a conflict of interest," Mike said, grinning when I brought him this information. "She's been funneling HOA money and homeowner money to her brother-in-law's company. Is that illegal? It depends. If she disclosed the relationship and the board approved it with her abstaining, then maybe it's okay. But I'm betting she didn't do any of that." He was right. There was no record of Patricia ever disclosing her relationship to Robert Hanson. There was no record of the board voting to approve contracts with his company. She'd just been signing them on her own authority. We amended the lawsuit to add allegations of self-dealing and breach of fiduciary duty. We also sent a letter to the board members Tom and Deborah, informing them of Patricia's conduct and suggesting they might want to remove her as president before the recall election. Tom responded within days, sending an email to all homeowners announcing that he was resigning from the board effective immediately, and that he'd been unaware of Patricia's conflicts of interest. Deborah followed suit 2 days later. That left Patricia as the only board member, which created an interesting situation. According to the bylaws, the board needed at least 3 members to conduct business. With only Patricia left, the board couldn't legally function. The special election took place on a cold Saturday in early March at the community clubhouse. 71 of the 80 homeowners showed up, which was apparently the highest turnout in the neighborhood's history. Patricia tried to run the meeting, but she was shouted down. Instead, Janet Thompson took over as a neutral moderator. The vote wasn't even close. Patricia, Deborah, and Tom were removed from the board by margins of better than 3-1. A new board was elected, with Janet as president, George as vice president, and an accountant named Sarah Kim as treasurer. One of the new board's first acts was to hire a forensic accountant to audit the HOA's books. The audit took 2 weeks and revealed what we'd all suspected. Over the past 18 months, Patricia had authorized over $70,000 in spending, much of it to her brother-in-law's company, and almost all of it at inflated rates. She'd also been paying herself a management fee of $500 a month, which wasn't authorized by the bylaws. The new board voted unanimously to report Patricia to the authorities. The Eden Prairie Police Department got involved, and a detective named Sarah O'Brien was assigned to the case. I met with Detective O'Brien in April, after the snow had finally started melting. She was in her 40s, professional and thorough, and she took copious notes as I explained my part of the story. So she hired her brother-in-law's company to do work at inflated rates and charged homeowners directly, O'Brien said. "And you believe this was part of a pattern?" "The audit shows it clearly. Hanson Excavation did work billed at nearly $30,000 over 18 months. None of it was competitively bid. All of it was approved solely by Patricia. What about the other board members? They say they didn't know, and honestly, I believe them. Patricia ran the board like her personal kingdom. She didn't share information with anyone. The investigation took months. Detective O'Brien interviewed dozens of homeowners, reviewed all the financial records, and brought in a white-collar crime specialist from the Hennepin County Sheriff's Office. In the meantime, my personal lawsuit was heading toward trial. Mike had filed a motion for summary judgment, arguing that the undisputed facts showed Patricia had violated the bylaws and trespassed on my property. The hearing was scheduled for late May, but before the hearing could happen, the criminal investigation reached a critical point. In early May, Detective O'Brien called me. "I wanted to give you a heads up," she said. "We're arresting Patricia Henderson tomorrow morning. We're charging her with theft by swindle and misconduct by a corporate officer, both felonies." "Yes." "The theft charge is for the self-dealing with her brother-in-law. The misconduct charge is for the way she abused her position on the board. We're also charging Robert Hanson as an accomplice." "What about restitution?" "That'll be up to the court, but typically in these cases, the defendants are required to pay back what they took. That should help the HOA and the individual homeowners who were overcharged." Patricia was arrested the next morning at her house. The local news covered it, running a story about HOA corruption that featured interviews with several homeowners, including me. I kept my comments brief, just stating that I hoped justice would be served and that the neighborhood could move forward. The criminal case moved slowly, as they always do. Patricia hired a lawyer who tried to argue that she'd made bookkeeping errors, but hadn't committed any crimes. The prosecutor wasn't buying it. The paper trail was too clear. Every inflated contract, every unauthorized payment, every instance of her brother-in-law's company getting work without competitive bidding. Robert Hanson flipped pretty quickly. He agreed to testify against Patricia in exchange for a reduced charge. He admitted that Patricia had approached him about starting an excavation company, that she'd promised him steady work through the HOA, and that she'd directed him to inflate his prices with the understanding that they'd split the excess profits. That testimony sealed Patricia's fate. Her lawyer tried to negotiate a plea deal, but the prosecutor was in no mood to be generous. Patricia had stolen from dozens of families, including several elderly residents on fixed incomes. She'd abused a position of trust. The prosecutor wanted jail time. The trial was scheduled for October, but Patricia's lawyer convinced her to plead guilty in September. She accepted a deal where she pled guilty to 1 count of theft by swindle and 1 count of misconduct by a corporate officer. The sentencing was scheduled for November. Meanwhile, my civil case had resolved much more quickly. Once the criminal charges were filed, Patricia's lawyer in the civil case recommended she settle. In August, we reached an agreement where the HOA paid me $5,000 to cover my damages, attorney's fees, and costs. The $2,000 charge was removed from my account. More importantly, the new board used the forensic audit to go after every improper charge Patricia had made. They hired a law firm to send demand letters to Patricia and Robert Hanson, seeking restitution for all the overcharges. Many homeowners got checks returning money they'd been improperly charged. The Thompsons got $1,800 back for the tree removal. Mrs. Chen got $150 back for the mailbox painting. But I wasn't done yet. I'd been thinking about that excavator for months. Patricia had hired it to remove my snow pile, charging me $2,000 for maybe 3 hours of work. The excavator itself, was what made that possible. And I'd learned that Robert Hansen had purchased the excavator specifically to do HOA work at Patricia's direction. I called Mike Reynolds. "Hypothetically," I said, "if someone purchased equipment with money they fraudulently obtained, could that equipment be seized as proceeds of crime?" "Absolutely," Mike said. "In fact, it usually is." "Why?" I explained my thinking. The excavator that had been used on my property had been purchased with fraud money. Robert Hansen had bought it specifically to commit fraud through overcharging for HOA work. It was, in essence, a tool of crime. "Talk to Detective O'Brien," Mike suggested. "She might be interested in this." Detective O'Brien was very interested. She'd been focused on the financial crimes, but the excavator represented tangible proceeds that could be seized and sold to help provide restitution to victims. She got a warrant and seized the excavator from Robert Hansen's yard within a week. The excavator sat in the police impound lot for months while the criminal case proceeded. In November, Patricia Henderson stood before Judge Margaret Sullivan in Hennepin County District Court for sentencing. The courtroom was packed with homeowners from Meadowbrook Estates. I sat in the front row with George, Janet, and about a dozen others. The prosecutor went first, laying out the scope of Patricia's crimes. $70,000 stolen from neighbors and friends. 18 months of systematic fraud. Abuse of a position of trust. He asked for 2 years in prison. Patricia's lawyer argued for probation, claiming Patricia had made mistakes but hadn't intended to hurt anyone. He pointed out that she was a first-time offender, that she'd already suffered consequences through losing her position and her reputation, and that jail time would serve no purpose. Then Judge Sullivan asked if any victims wanted to speak. Mrs. Chen stood up first. She was 78 years old, a widow living on Social Security. "That $200 she charged me for painting my mailbox, Mrs. Chen said, her voice shaking slightly. "That was my grocery money for the month. I had to borrow from my daughter. I was ashamed. This woman, she had no shame. She stole from all of us." 3 more homeowners spoke, each describing how Patricia's actions had hurt them financially and violated their trust. Then it was my turn. "Your Honor," I said, standing up, "Patricia Henderson came onto my property without permission, removed something I'd built for a specific purpose, and then tried to charge me $2,000 for the privilege. When I questioned her, she threatened to put a lien on my house and take my home. That's not a mistake. That's not an error in judgment. That's abuse of power, plain and simple, and it was part of a pattern that hurt dozens of families." Judge Sullivan listened to everyone, taking notes. When the victim statements were done, she looked down at Patricia. "Miss Henderson," the judge said, "you held a position of trust in your community. People relied on you to manage their HOA fairly and honestly. Instead, you stole from them. You enriched yourself and your family members at their expense. You used the rules and bylaws not to help the community, but as weapons to extract money from your neighbors. This court takes such violations very seriously." She sentenced Patricia to 18 months in prison, with the possibility of early release after 12 months for good behavior. She also ordered Patricia to pay full restitution of $72,000 to be split among all the homeowners who'd been overcharged. Robert Hansen, who'd already pled guilty to a lesser charge, got 6 months in jail and was also ordered to pay restitution. As part of the restitution process, the court ordered all of Robert Hansen's business assets to be liquidated and the proceeds distributed to victims. That included the excavator. The excavator was scheduled to be auctioned by the county in December. The auction would be online, with the machine going to the highest bidder. The proceeds would go into the restitution fund, I'd been thinking about this for weeks. The excavator was a nice one, a Kubota KX040 with only about 200 hours on it. Retail value was probably around $60,000, but at a government auction, it might go for $40,000 or $45,000. I'd done well in my career as a software engineer, had some money saved up, and the idea of owning the machine that had started this whole saga appealed to me on multiple levels. But there was a problem. If I bought the machine, the money would go into a restitution fund that I was part of. Essentially, I'd be paying myself, at least in part. I called Mike Reynolds to see if that was legal. "It's not illegal," Mike said. "You'd be paying fair market value at auction. The fact that you're also a victim doesn't change that, but here's an idea. What if you bought the machine and then donated its use to the HOA for community projects?" That was brilliant. The new HOA board had been talking about doing some improvements to the common areas, including regrading a drainage ditch and expanding the parking area near the clubhouse. An excavator would be perfect for that work. I registered for the auction and did my research on the machine. It was in good condition, well maintained, with recent service records. I set my maximum bid at $42,000, figuring that was fair market value for a government auction. The auction took place on a Friday morning in mid-December. It was online, so I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop, watching the bids come in. The machine started at $20,000. Within 5 minutes, it was up to $35,000. I jumped in at $36,000. Another bidder went to $37,000. I countered at $38,000. Back and forth we went, climbing in $1,000 increments. At $41,000, the other bidder dropped out. I waited, watching the clock count down. With 30 seconds left, a new bidder appeared and jumped to $42,000. I had 10 seconds to decide. My maximum was $42,000 and I was already there. But something made me bump it one more time. $43,000. I hit submit with 3 seconds left. The auction closed. I'd won. The county sent me the paperwork and I arranged to pick up the excavator the following week. George came with me to the impound lot, bringing his truck and trailer. The machine was bigger than I remembered. Bright yellow, the Kubota logo prominent on the side, it looked almost new. A county worker helped me load it onto the trailer, showing me the basics of how to operate it. "You know how to run one of these?" he asked. "I watched some YouTube videos," I said, which was true but probably not reassuring. "Good luck," he said, grinning. Getting the excavator home was an adventure. George drove carefully and I followed behind in my truck, hazard lights on. We got some stares from other drivers. It's not every day you see an excavator being trailed through Eden Prairie in the middle of December. I'd already prepared a spot for it in my backyard, clearing out an area near my garage. We unloaded it carefully, and I spent the next hour just sitting in the cab, familiarizing myself with the controls. It was intimidating but also exhilarating. The next HOA board meeting was scheduled for the following week. I showed up with a proposal. I'd bought the excavator that had been seized from Robert Hansen. I was willing to donate its use to the HOA for community improvement projects, with me as the operator, in exchange for the HOA covering fuel and maintenance costs. Janet, George, and Sarah, the 3 board members, looked at each other and then back at me. "Let me get this straight," Janet said. "You bought the excavator that Patricia's brother-in-law used to commit fraud, the same excavator that started this whole thing. And now you want to use it to help the community." "That's exactly what I'm proposing." George started laughing. "That's the most poetic justice I've ever heard." The board voted unanimously to accept my proposal. Over the winter, I used the excavator for several projects. We regraded the drainage ditch in the common area, which had been causing flooding problems for years. We expanded the parking area by the clubhouse, adding space for 10 more cars. We even helped Mrs. Chen level out her backyard, which had developed some serious erosion problems. I also used it on my own property, building a better snow management system with permanent berms that would direct snow exactly where I wanted it. No more massive piles along the property line. Instead, I had a sophisticated system that kept my driveway clear while creating natural windbreaks. Word got around the neighborhood about the excavator and its history. People started calling it Henry's revenge machine, which I thought was a bit dramatic, but also kind of accurate. Kids would come by to watch when I was working on HOA projects, fascinated by the big yellow machine. Patricia Henderson went to prison in January. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she'd tried to appeal her sentence, but it was denied. She'd serve at least a year, probably more. Robert Hansen was released after 3 months in jail, but his contracting business was finished. He'd lost all his equipment, his reputation was destroyed, and he ended up moving out of state to start over somewhere else. The restitution payments came slowly but steadily. The liquidation of Robert Hansen's assets, including my payment for the excavator, brought in about $75,000, which was actually more than the court-ordered restitution. Every homeowner who'd been overcharged got their money back, plus a little extra. I got back my $2,000, plus another $300 as my share of the excess. The new HOA board instituted a bunch of reforms. All contracts over $500 now required competitive bidding. All board members had to disclose any conflicts of interest. There was a new policy requiring that homeowners be given written notice and an opportunity for a hearing before any violation enforcement. And most importantly, there were term limits. No one could serve as HOA president for more than 2 consecutive years. Things settled into a new normal over the following months. The neighborhood felt different, less tense. People weren't afraid of getting surprise fines anymore. The HOA started focusing on what it was supposed to do: maintaining common areas, organizing community events, and helping neighbors work together. I became something of a local celebrity, the guy who'd stood up to HOA tyranny and somehow ended up owning an excavator. People I barely knew would wave to me at the grocery store. A reporter from a local paper did a story about the whole saga, which got picked up by a couple of national news outlets. For a few weeks, I was getting emails from people all over the country dealing with their own HOA nightmares. My advice was always the same: know your bylaws, document everything, don't be afraid to push back, and if necessary, get a lawyer and fight. Spring came, and with it, the annual neighborhood garage sale that Patricia used to organize. Janet asked if I'd help set up, using the excavator to move some concrete barriers for the parking area. I agreed, and on the morning of the sale, I fired up the machine and got to work. Mrs. Chen came over while I was working. "Henry," she said, "I wanted to thank you again. Not just for the money, but for standing up to that woman. She made me feel small, like I'd done something wrong for having an old mailbox. You made it right." "We all made it right, Mrs. Chen. We all stood together." She patted my arm and walked away, and I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Community. Real community, not the fake version Patricia had tried to enforce with fines and rules. The garage sale was a huge success. We raised money for a new playground in the common area, and I volunteered to use the excavator to prepare the site. Over the summer, I spent several weekends digging, grading, and moving earth. Kids would come watch, and I'd let them sit in the cab with me, their parents taking pictures. By the time fall came around, the playground was finished. It had new swings, a slide, monkey bars, and a sandbox I'd dug out and lined properly. The neighborhood held a grand opening party, complete with a ribbon cutting and a potluck dinner. I brought the excavator, parked it nearby, and let kids climb on it while their parents supervised. There was something deeply satisfying about seeing that machine, which had been purchased with fraud money and used to victimize people, now being celebrated as a tool that had helped build something good. Janet gave a speech at the ribbon cutting. She talked about the challenges the neighborhood had faced, the importance of standing up for what's right, and the power of community coming together. She specifically thanked me for being willing to challenge Patricia's overreach. Henry could have just paid the $2,000 and moved on, Janet said. A lot of people would have. It wasn't worth the hassle, right? But Henry saw something wrong and decided to fight it. And because he did, we discovered a much bigger problem. We discovered that our HOA, which was supposed to serve us, had become something else entirely. So thank you, Henry, and thank you to everyone else who stood up too. People clapped, and I felt embarrassed but also proud. I'd moved to this neighborhood looking for a quiet place to live. I'd found something better, a real community, one that had been tested and had come through stronger. The excavator became a fixture in the neighborhood. I used it regularly for projects, both for the HOA and for individual neighbors who needed help. I never charged anyone. The machine had been paid for with money that came from the community, and as far as I was concerned, it belonged to the community, even if the title was in my name. I also got pretty good at operating it. What had started as watching YouTube videos turned into real skill. I could dig a precise trench, grade a lawn to perfect evenness, or move a boulder with surprising delicacy. George joked that I'd found my calling. In November, almost exactly a year after Patricia's sentencing, I got a call from Detective O'Brien. "I wanted to let you know," she said. "Patricia Henderson was released on parole yesterday. She served 13 months. How's she doing? She's required to continue paying restitution, and she's on parole for another 5 years. She moved to Duluth, staying with her sister up there. As far as I know, she's not involved with any HOAs." I laughed at that. "Probably for the best. I also wanted to say thank you. Your case was what broke this whole thing open. Without you pushing back on that snow pile charge, we might never have found the bigger fraud. I just didn't want to pay $2,000 for something I didn't authorize. Well, your stubbornness saved a lot of people a lot of money, so thank you." After we hung up, I thought about Patricia. I didn't feel any satisfaction about her going to prison. I didn't hate her. I just felt sad that she'd thrown away her reputation and freedom for some extra money. She'd had the respect of the neighborhood, a position of trust, and she'd squandered it all. But I also thought about what had come from it: a stronger community, better HOA governance. A playground built with an excavator that had been seized from the person who'd committed the crimes. There was symmetry to it all. Winter came again, and with it, more snow. My new snow management system worked perfectly. The berms I'd built directed the snow exactly where I wanted it, creating natural windbreaks without the massive piles that had started all this trouble. I looked out my window one morning, coffee in hand, watching the snow fall. The excavator sat in my backyard, covered with a tarp for the winter. Come spring, there would be more projects. The HOA wanted to build a walking trail through the common area. Mrs. Chen wanted a proper patio in her backyard. The Thompsons needed some drainage work. My phone rang. It was Janet. "Henry, I hate to bother you, but we've got a situation. The drainage pond on the north end of the development is overflowing. We need to dig an emergency overflow channel before it floods the Martins' basement. Any chance you could bring the excavator?" I looked at the clock. It was 7 in the morning on a Saturday. A year ago, I would have been annoyed. Now I just smiled. "Give me 30 minutes," I said. I grabbed my coat, went outside, and pulled the tarp off the excavator. The engine started right up, diesel smoke puffing in the cold air. I drove it down the street toward the north end of the development, waving at neighbors who were outside shoveling their driveways. The drainage pond was indeed overflowing, water pooling dangerously close to the Martins' foundation. Janet was there with George and a few other neighbors, all looking worried. "Where do you need the channel?" I asked. Janet pointed to a low spot about 30 yards away. "If we can direct the overflow that way, it'll run into the storm drain system." I got to work. The excavator made quick work of it, digging a precise channel that would carry the excess water safely away. Within an hour, the problem was solved. Water was flowing through the new channel, and the level in the pond was dropping. "You're a lifesaver, Mrs. Martin said, bringing me a thermos of hot coffee. That water was 6 inches from our basement door. "Just doing my part," I said, accepting the coffee gratefully. As I drove the excavator back home, I thought about how much had changed in the past year. I'd bought this house looking for peace and quiet. Instead, I'd found myself in the middle of an HOA nightmare, facing down a corrupt board president and threats of liens and foreclosure. But in fighting back, I'd found something unexpected. I'd found a community worth fighting for. I'd made real friends. I'd learned a new skill. And somehow, I'd ended up owning an excavator, which was not something I'd ever imagined. The machine was more than just a piece of equipment now. It was a symbol of what happened when people stood up for what was right. It represented justice, in a weird, practical way. Patricia had used her brother-in-law's excavator as a tool of fraud, but now it was being used to help the same community she'd hurt. I parked the excavator back in my yard and covered it with the tarp. My phone buzzed with a text from George. "Beer later. Want to hear about my latest woodworking project?" I smiled and texted back. "Sounds good." Life in Meadowbrook Estates had returned to what it should have been all along. A place where neighbors helped each other, where the HOA served the community instead of ruling it, and where a guy could pile his snow wherever he wanted on his own property, without getting charged $2,000 for the privilege. And if anyone ever needed an excavator, well, I had one of those now. Thanks to Patricia Henderson's fraud, the neighborhood had gained an unexpected asset. The machine that had been purchased with ill-gotten gains had been redeemed, transformed from a tool of corruption into something that helped people. Sometimes, things work out in unexpected ways. I'd started this journey angry about a snow pile and a bogus charge. I'd ended it with new friends, a stronger community, and a bright yellow excavator parked in my backyard. Not a bad outcome, all things considered. As I sat on my porch that evening, beer in hand, watching the sun set over the snow-covered neighborhood, I felt content. Patricia was paying for her crimes. The community had learned valuable lessons about governance and accountability, and I had an excavator, which was just objectively cool. George came over and sat down next to me, bringing his own beer. "You ever think about how weird this all is?" he asked. "What do you mean? A year ago, you were just a guy with a snow pile. Now you're the neighborhood hero with an excavator," I laughed. "I'm not a hero, I just didn't want to pay $2,000. "That's how heroes start," George said. "They're just people who decide they've had enough and push back." We sat in comfortable silence, watching the neighborhood settle in for the evening. Lights came on in windows. Cars pulled into driveways. Kids played in yards, building snowmen and having snowball fights. This was what community was supposed to be. Not rules and fines and intimidation, but people living their lives, helping each other when needed, and standing together when threatened. My snow pile was long gone, melted away months ago. But what it represented, the principle I'd fought for, that was still here. The right to use your own property as you see fit. The right to question authority. The right to demand accountability from those in power, and I had an excavator to prove it.